There's something different about people who remember 25-cent gas prices. Maybe it's the way they understand value isn't fixed, but fluid. Maybe it's how they navigate economic anxiety with historical perspective. Maybe it's that they witness the world fundamentally transform around them. Because remembering cheap gas didn't just mean you're old enough to recall different numbers at the pump. It forged a specific type of psychological adaptability that experts are only now beginning to understand. And by the end of this video, you're going to see why this experience created some of the most economically resilient people alive today. Let's start with something most people get completely wrong. Modern culture assumes economic hardship is always unprecedented, but people who remember 25-cent gas prove that theory dead wrong. Picture yourself as a 16-year-old in 1972, pulling up to a gas station in your first car, a beat-up Ford that your uncle sold you for $200. The attendant comes out to pump your gas because you don't do it yourself yet. He washes your windshield, checks your oil, and fills your tank completely for $3. $3 for a full tank. You hand him a $5 bill and get $2 back, enough to buy burgers for you and your girlfriend. You drive away understanding, somewhere deep in your teenage brain, that the world is abundant, that freedom is affordable, that being young and mobile doesn't require wealth. And then, 6 years later, everything changes. Picture this: summer afternoon, 1970. You're 14 years old in the passenger seat while your father fills the tank. The station has 3 pumps, no line, prices clearly displayed, 23.9 cents per gallon. Your father doesn't even look at the price, he just fills it. This wasn't privilege, it was living in an era of assumed abundance. You learned that resources were reliably available, that prices stayed stable, that you didn't need to strategize around basic needs, that the world worked predictably. Psychologists call this developing secure attachment to economic systems, but for you, it was just normal. Here's what's remarkable. You were forming baseline assumptions about how the world operates during a temporary moment of unusual stability. Gas was cheap and available. That felt permanent. Kids today have only known volatile prices, their parents calculating whether to fill the tank or wait for prices to drop. They've learned economic anxiety is constant because they never experienced a before. But you remember when gas was just gas. This wasn't naivety, it was context. Picture this: October 1973. You're 17 and suddenly there are lines at every gas station. The price has doubled, then tripled. Your father sits in line for an hour to get 10 gallons on a Thursday, his designated day based on his license plate number. This wasn't just inconvenience, it was watching the rules change overnight. You learned that stability is an illusion, that international events affect your daily life, that systems you took for granted can collapse without warning, that abundance isn't guaranteed. Neuroscientists call this stress inoculation through economic shock exposure, but for you, it was terrifying. Here's what's remarkable. You were experiencing your first major economic disruption as a teenager, watching adults panic, feeling the fear ripple through your community. Your brain was being rewired in real time. Modern young people have lived through multiple recessions and crises, developing chronic economic anxiety. They've learned instability is normal because they never had a before, but you remember instability through contrast. This wasn't trauma, it was education.
Picture this: 1974. You're 18 and you can only get gas on odd-numbered days because your license plate ends in 7. You're planning your entire week around fuel availability, combining trips, carpooling, calculating whether you have enough to get to work. This wasn't just adapting, it was learning resource management under artificial scarcity. You learned to plan ahead with incomplete information, to optimize behavior around constraints, to find creativity in limitation, to accept rules you couldn't control. Psychologists call this developing executive function through enforced behavioral modification, but for you, it was just surviving. Here's what's remarkable. You were building cognitive flexibility while watching the social contract shift. The government was now controlling when you could buy gas. That changed something fundamental. Today's generation complains about high prices, but never faces actual rationing or unavailability. They've learned to expect access, even when complaining about cost. But you learned access itself isn't guaranteed. This wasn't acceptance, it was adaptation. Picture this, 1979. You're 23, starting your first real job. Gas is now 86 cents per gallon, more than triple what you remember. You're standing at the pump doing math. Can I afford to fill it completely, or do I put in $10 and hope it lasts? This wasn't poverty, it was recalibrating your understanding of normal. You learned that the prices of your youth weren't coming back, that nostalgia for the past is economically useless, that adaptation beats longing, that you adjust to new realities or suffer. Neuroscientists call this cognitive reappraisal under sustained economic pressure, but for you, it was just dealing with it. Here's what's remarkable. You were learning economic resilience through personal experience, not theory. Every tank you filled reinforced that the world had changed permanently. Kids today have never known anything but expensive gas, so they lack the contrast that creates resilience. They've learned this is just how it is, because they have no before. But you learned to navigate change itself. This wasn't bitterness, it was recalibration. Picture this, summer 1975. You're 19, planning a road trip with friends, but now you have to calculate fuel costs, map out gas stations, budget for something that used to be negligible. Freedom now requires spreadsheets. This wasn't the death of spontaneity, it was learning that everything has a cost, even liberty. You learned to plan farther ahead, to factor in variables you'd ignored before, to recognize that independence requires resources, that being young no longer meant being carefree. Psychologists call this developing delayed gratification through forced planning behavior, but for you, it was just being responsible. Here's what's remarkable. You were building financial literacy through something as simple as wanting to drive somewhere. Economics became personal and immediate. Modern young people face similar calculations, but never experience the contrast of when you didn't have to. They've learned road trips are expensive because they always were in their experience. But you learned that costs change worlds. This wasn't loss, it was maturation.
Picture this, 1981. You're 25 and you're trading in your gas-guzzling muscle car for a fuel-efficient Honda Civic. You feel slightly embarrassed. This isn't what you dreamed of driving, but at 35 miles per gallon, it's survival. This wasn't defeat, it was learning that pride adapts to reality. You learned that identity adjusts to economics, that practicality isn't betrayal, that the choices you make at 25 are different from the choices you imagined at 16. Neuroscientists call this identity reformation under economic constraint, but for you, it was just growing up. Here's what's remarkable. You were learning to separate self-worth from consumption symbols. The car didn't define you, your ability to adapt did. Today's young people face similar pressures toward efficiency, but with different cultural messaging. They've learned that small cars can be cool because marketing told them so, but you learned it through necessity overriding preference. This wasn't compromise, it was evolution. Picture this, 1982, you're 26, offered a promotion that requires a longer commute. Before 1973, you'd have taken it without thinking. Now you're calculating miles, gas costs, wear on your car, whether the raise covers the difference. This wasn't overthinking, it was understanding that hidden costs matter. You learned that headline numbers don't tell full stories, that every choice has downstream effects, that economic literacy means factoring in everything, not just salary. Psychologists call this developing holistic cost-benefit analysis skills, but for you, it was just being smart. Here's what's remarkable. You were building sophisticated economic thinking through personal stakes. This wasn't a classroom exercise, this was your life. Kids today make similar calculations, but with different variables. Student loans, healthcare costs, housing prices.
They've learned to calculate complexity because modern life demands it, but you learned it first through something simpler, the cost of getting there. This wasn't paranoia, it was wisdom. Picture this, 2008, you're 52 and gas hits $4 per gallon. Everyone around you is panicking, but you remember when it tripled in a year. You remember lines. You remember rationing. This feels expensive, but not apocalyptic. This wasn't smugness, it was historical perspective creating emotional insulation. You learned that crises feel different when you've survived similar before, that panic is often amnesia, that humanity adapts, that this too shall pass. Neuroscientists call this stress inoculation through pattern recognition across decades, but for you, it was just remembering. Here's what's remarkable. You were using 50-year-old memories to regulate present-moment anxiety. Your past became your armor against fear. Younger people facing their first major gas spike had no historical anchor, so the crisis felt unprecedented. They've learned each shock is unique because they lack the pattern, but you learned patterns exist. This wasn't minimizing, it was perspective.
Picture this, 2020. You're 64, and you're looking at electric vehicles. Part of you resists. You've spent 50 years working within the gasoline system, understanding it, mastering it. Change feels like starting over. This wasn't resistance. It was recognizing when your expertise becomes obsolete. You learned that the systems you adapted to might not last either, that the future requires new adaptations, that even your hard-won resilience needs updating. Psychologists call this neuroplasticity challenges in later adulthood, but for you, it's just confusing. Here's what's remarkable. You're being asked to abandon mastery built over decades. The gas price literacy you developed, meaningless in an electric world. Today's young people are growing up with multiple fuel systems coexisting, learning flexibility from the start. They've learned not to overinvest in any one system because everything changes. But you learned investment and now face obsolescence. This wasn't failure, it was the cycle continuing. Picture this. Today, your 12-year-old grandchild asks if you really paid 25 cents for gas. You say yes and watch their eyes go wide with disbelief. You try to explain what that meant, the freedom, the abundance, the shock of losing it. This wasn't nostalgia, it was attempting to pass on economic wisdom through story. You learned that lived experience is data the next generation needs, that your memories aren't just personal, they're historical, that perspective is an inheritance. Psychologists call this intergenerational transmission of economic resilience frameworks, but for you, it's just trying to help them understand. Here's what's remarkable. You're teaching economic adaptability through autobiography. Your life is their textbook. Kids today will face their own economic shocks, their own sudden changes, their own need to adapt. They'll learn resilience through their own crises, but you're trying to give them a head start. This wasn't lecturing, it was legacy. But some experiences cut deeper. Consider this. You're 24 years old in 1978, and you've just been laid off. The economy is tanking, inflation is out of control, gas prices are rising weekly. You have $80 to your name and a quarter tank of gas. You're sitting in your car in a grocery store parking lot, trying to decide if you can afford to drive to a job interview 40 miles away, knowing you might not have enough gas to get home if you don't get the job. The gauge needle hovers near empty. Your hands shake on the steering wheel, and you realize this moment isn't about gas prices at all. It's about how quickly security evaporates, how the world that seemed so stable at 16 is revealed as fragile at 24. How the 25-cent gas wasn't just cheap fuel, it was the price of innocence, and you can never get either back. This imprinted a profound truth. Economic security is always temporary. But that hard lesson existed alongside something darker.
because living through that volatility also created a generation that sometimes judges younger people for financial struggles. You survived with less, or so you tell yourself, forgetting that 25-cent gas meant something different than $4 gas, that your first apartment rent was $150 when today's is $1,500, that the scale has changed even if the struggle feels similar. That resilience you built sometimes manifests as lack of empathy, as we had it harder, when really you just had it different. This created people who hold both truths, genuine economic resilience and incomplete understanding that the game has changed, survival skills and blind spots, adaptability earned through crisis, and judgment born from misremembering. This complexity might be their most valuable inheritance. Let's return to that gas station. You, 16 years old, getting a full tank for $3, driving away feeling like the world is yours because mobility is affordable and freedom is accessible and nothing will ever change. These people carry something the modern world desperately needs. They remember when gas was cheap, then wasn't, then got expensive, then got really expensive. They remember adapting to rationing, to calculation, to planning, to sacrifice. They remember the world transforming around them and surviving anyway. They're living proof that resilience is built, not born. Competence comes from practice, not protection. The best gift isn't stability, but the capacity to adapt when stability ends. Economic shocks are survivable when you've survived them before. In a world of constant economic anxiety, inflation fears, and volatile everything, they stand as evidence of another way. Not perfect, not without blind spots, but a way that produced people who can remember abundance, survive scarcity, adapt to new realities, and keep driving forward no matter what the price says. They grew up when gas was 25 cents, lived through it hitting $1, $2, $4. They learned to plan, to calculate, to adjust, to accept that the world changes and you change with it, or you get left behind. And somehow they learned to hold it all: the memory of abundance, the shock of loss, the adaptation to new normals, the resilience built through crisis after crisis. That wasn't just remembering cheap gas. That was learning that you survive what you think will break you.